Welcome to Downey High School's online history class. I'm your instructor, Ms. Lojano, and today we are going to be looking at an overview of the progressive reforms. So you'll see on the right that progressivism was a movement between 1900 and 1920 that aimed to address problems that emerged during industrialization, immigration, and urbanization. So we spoke quite a bit in the last unit about a lot of those problems. It takes about 30 years for those problems to emerge, so 1870 to 1900, and then the progressives are going to start solving those problems between 1900 and 1920. Both parties are involved in making these reforms. So the two parties during this period are the Republicans and the Democrats. Remember, this is a different party system than the one that we're in now, but both parties consider themselves progressive. And it involves three presidents, two of whom are Republican and one is a Democrat. So you can see them pictured here. Teddy Roosevelt is the one with the glasses, Taft up here on the left, both Republicans, and then Wilson down here in the corner is our one Democrat from the period. Okay, so let's talk about important goals of the progressives. The first important goal for the progressives was to fix political corruption by returning control to the people. And you can see up here, remember we talked about political machines and how big business and politicians were sort of in bed together during this period. You can see that depicted in this cartoon. It's called The Bosses of the Senate. These are the big trust guys. You can see how they have these really big tummies, which is a way of saying they have a lot of money and power, and they're overseeing the Senate, right? So the progressives were like, we need to fix this, and the way to fix it is to give power back to the regular people instead of these monopolists that have all of this power and control. Okay, so that was goal number one, fix political corruption. Goal number two is to fix economic abuses of capitalism. They want to do that by reducing the dominance of monopolies through antitrust laws, and they want to correct problems with working conditions. Okay, so we obviously talked about some of the problems in factories. And then with the monopolies, we're getting to this point where small businesses are having a hard time. You have consumer protection issues that emerge. And so they're saying maybe we need to break up these monopolies. Okay, the third issue that they want to address is social injustices, particularly towards women and children. We're going to see women taking a larger role outside of the home during the progressive era, which will culminate in them gaining the right to vote through the 19th Amendment. And then we're also going to see this with regard to drinking. We'll talk more about that in a second, and the ban on alcohol that emerges during this period. And then the last big goal is to protect the environment from dangers of industrial growth. And we are not going to focus on that in this lecture, but Teddy Roosevelt essentially founded the national park system that we have now, where the progressives decided we want to conserve some of this land and protect it from development. Okay, two things to note. The progressives were conservative in orientation. They wanted to save America from the dangers of a socialist revolution. So during this period, there are a bunch of people that are like, there are so many problems. Maybe we should consider socialism instead. And the progressives say, no, we don't want socialism. But if we don't want socialism, we need to fix the biggest problems of capitalism, right? So their goal is actually to preserve the current system by fixing the most prominent abuses of the system. Okay, and then the last thing that's kind of interesting about the progressives, the dark side of them is a very prevalent racism, and we will talk about that at the end. Okay, so here we go. Let's get into some specific reforms. So the first issue that the progressives are going to address is working conditions and poverty. And they are going to do this, first of all, by taking on child labor. So one of their goals is to end child labor. The 1904 National Child Labor Committee forced laws banning child labor and setting maximum working hours for children. Some of this has definitely evolved over time, and child labor is a complicated issue, right? Like, at what point do you say that a child is old enough to work? Right now in California at 15 and a half, you can get the permit, right? And then 16, you can work, but like, where's the line on that? Okay, but this is when we're going to start creating precedent to end child labor. They're also going to work on setting a 10-hour workday and getting workers' compensation for injured employees. So that means if you're harmed or injured during your workday, that there's some kind of insurance that can protect you from firing and can also give you some money while you try to get back on your feet. So they're going to work on those issues. What we're also going to see is some independent charities that are formed to help poor people. So the YMCA, for example, I know now that's more of a gym, but it originally founded as a place for soup kitchens and a place where poor people could come to get help. And the Salvation Army was also founded during this period. And then a group of charities that we call settlement houses, which is essentially a place where immigrants could go to get help as they were coming into the country. So one of the most famous is called Hull House. It was in Chicago, and they had a whole variety of programs. And basically, when you came off the boat, you could come and stay with them. They had a live-in program. They had skills programs, so you could learn English, you could learn a skill, right? And so Jane Addams is basically a whole bunch of middle-class white women that said, we want to help immigrants get settled into the country. And this is not government. Okay, so this is independent charities, just people that are saying, hey, we think that we need to do our part to fix these problems. Okay, the second issue we're going to talk about is, again, in the socioeconomic category, and that is consumer protection. Okay, so you can see on the left over here, it's a really famous cartoon. That's Teddy Roosevelt. You can identify him by the cowboy hat and then those little spectacles that he has. And he has this rake here, which is a reference to the muckrakers. We talked about the muckrakers in the last unit. Muckrakers were journalists who wrote about the corrupt side of business, also government. The one we looked at last unit was Jacob Riis, who took all those pictures of living conditions. But in this unit, we're looking at another one named Upton Sinclair, who wrote a book called The Jungle, depicting sickening conditions of the meatpacking industry. And actually, Upton Sinclair was a socialist. He wanted a socialist revolution. That was the purpose of his book. But people read the book and they were like, who cares about socialism? The meat is gross, right? They're like, what's up with all the rats? And so it didn't start a socialist revolution. Instead, it led to regulation of meat packing because people were like, I don't want to eat that. So this is going to lead to two laws, the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. This is kind of the foundation for like what we have now, which is the FDA, where there's government inspections to make sure that what you're eating is clean and that people are reporting what is in your food. Okay, the third issue we want to talk about is an economic issue, and that has to do with breaking up trust. Okay, so these huge monopolies have formed, and the sense is that there's too much power in too few people's hands, and also that this has reduced competition. And frankly, trust busting and the whole trust situation is really complex. Mr. Acevedo, my gosh, I was going to use his first name. Okay, so Mr. Acevedo talked a little bit about Amazon. If you watched his Ed Puzzle in the last unit, and that's just super complex, right? People like Amazon because it sends you stuff in 2 days, right? The reason that trusts get big is because they're very efficient, and sometimes that can be a good thing. At the same time, when they get too powerful, then that can lead to corruption in the government and it can reduce competition with small business. So it's a really complex issue that government wades into sometimes. And during this period is the first period that we have antitrust acts come out at the federal level. So the first one is called the Sherman Antitrust Act. That is followed up with the Clayton Antitrust Act, which actually forms the foundation for antitrust legislation that we have now. Both of those were intended to break up these large monopolies and try to increase competition. Also, under Wilson, the Federal Trade Commission was established. You'll hear this in the news referred to often as the FTC. And the purpose of the FTC is to enforce the Clayton Antitrust Act and provide consumer protection from fraud or false advertising. So if you feel that a business has taken advantage of you, you can actually file a suit against them using the FTC. Their job is basically to be a watchdog over business practices and try to protect consumers from fraudulent practices. Oh, and you can see, I should have mentioned this, on the left, you see this cartoon. So that, again, Teddy Roosevelt on the right is wrestling. This is supposed to be when he was trying to take out the train monopolies, right? So you can see this interplay between government and business. Teddy Roosevelt was actually nicknamed the Trust Buster. Okay, let's take a look at the fourth issue, fixing government corruption and political machines. So you can see on the left, that's a cartoon of Boss Tweed, the Tammany Hall political machine that we looked at last unit. And the goal, or the way that the progressives thought we could do this, was by giving more power to the people, right? The average people. That's who we need to empower. It's very populist in that way. Okay, so there are a couple of ideas they have for how this could work out. And these first couple are actually, they have been implemented, and they're more commonly known as, propositions or props. So like if you hear in the news Prop 19 or Prop whatever, like any prop, the propositions are two kinds. One is called an initiative, and that is where the bill is actually written by citizens. Okay, so if you see in your ballot, it says Prop 19 initiative, that means average people wrote this law and put it in there for you to vote on it. Okay, and so really anybody can write a law if they want to, if they get enough signatures, and then that will go onto the ballot and everybody votes. So in the last election, you saw the one that got a lot of play about Uber and yeah, like should those companies be allowed to be exceptions to a previous law that had been passed? Okay, so that is an initiative. It goes on the ballot and then everybody votes on it. Do they want it or not? California actually got rid of the death penalty a couple of years ago using an initiative. Okay, so this is the people write the law and then everybody votes. A referendum is where citizens vote on a law that was written by the state legislature, and then they are re-voting on it. Okay, so this would be like, say, the state legislature passes a law, like the one that came out that says students have to start school after 8:30 now, right? They have a rule that's coming out for that. Okay, if all the parents decide we hate this, we can't get our kids to school on time, what they could do is they could get enough signatures to have a referendum, and then everyone in California would re-vote on that issue, right? So they would say, maybe we don't want this, and the people actually override the state legislature. Okay, so the intention of both of these is to let the people be more involved in passing laws. Okay, the third thing that they institute is called a recall, where you can remove public officials from office before their term ends. This is at the state level. So at the federal level, like with the president, when we try to remove the president early from office, anybody know what that's called? That's right, impeachment. Okay, so there was no process to do that at the state level. The recall is instituted so that if you really don't like somebody, you can get them out before their term is over. And California actually did this quite a while back with a governor named Gray Davis. This is how Arnold Schwarzenegger became the governor of California. There's a recall on Gray Davis. Okay, so that is an option that you have. You can vote somebody out of office if you don't like them. And that is a way to protect the people from political corruption, or at least that was the intention. Okay, the last big change is the 17th Amendment, which allows for direct election of senators. So we talked about in here how every state gets 2 senators, and the people vote on those. Prior to the 17th Amendment, the state legislatures chose the senators. So you voted for the state people, the state legislatures voted for the senator. They cut out the middleman. Okay, so they're like, everybody gets to vote. So when you vote every 6 years for the senator, and when you guys start voting, you'll actually get to choose. You choose who you want. So all of these are trying to give more power to the people to undercut political corruption. Okay, last issue we're going to discuss is the social ills of drinking, which during this period was really about violence against women and children and workplace safety. Okay, so you can see on the left there's a political cartoon for, this is a movement called Prohibition, where they're saying they want to make the sale, creation of, or like production of, and transportation of alcohol illegal. Okay, so it's not illegal to purchase or to consume, but if you were the supplier, like you're selling it, that's not legal. It's not legal to transport it anywhere, and it's not legal to make it. Okay, that was how the law was designed. And you can see here in the cartoon, this is a criticism of booze, right? Like, what are the problems with alcohol? We make people poor, right? These people are spending too much of their money on alcohol. Hun Rule Association, this Hun is a reference to Germany. Because many breweries were German, and again, this overlaps with World War I. So there's a lot of actually anti-German sentiment in banning alcohol. We'll talk more about that when we get to the 20s. We cause poverty and crime. We rob women and children, right? So men would get drunk and then beat their wives and children. And so what they decide to do is to ban the sale, production, transport of alcohol in the entire country through the 18th Amendment. We call this the great experiment, right? They're like, let's see how this goes. And actually, it didn't go great. We'll talk more about that when we studied the 20s. They actually repealed this amendment with the 21st Amendment, which sends that back down to the state level. But during this period, they're going to try to get rid of alcohol to try to solve these problems. Workplace safety is the other thing they're trying to do, right? If you're drunk while you're farming, okay, like it's not great, but that's not a huge problem. If you're drunk while you're working with factory equipment, you're going to lose an arm, right? So that becomes an issue, and they decide, okay, let's get rid of alcohol. So the 18th Amendment is going to do that. The 19th Amendment is going to expand public roles for women by giving women the right to vote. And this organization, you can see here, Women's Christian Temperance Union, or the WCTU, actually worked on both banning alcohol and women voting because those issues felt so interconnected during this period. Banning alcohol was about protecting women from drunk men, and then also giving them the vote allowed them to have more voice in society. So both of these amendments are going to be, in some ways, directed at women's rights. Banning alcohol, 18th, and then giving women the right to vote, the 19th Amendment. All right, dark side of progressivism is a very prevalent racism. Now, I will say not everyone in the progressive movement is associated with this. Jane Addams' Whole House settlement houses were quite renowned for their religious tolerance and international tolerance. Okay, but many progressives were quite racist, and at the very least, they're not going to address major racist issues. So Jim Crow laws are going to expand during this period throughout the country. And Margaret Sanger is probably the most poignant example of this. So this is Margaret Sanger down here. Margaret Sanger advocated for birth control for women. Okay, so this is back when it was actually illegal for women to talk to their doctors about getting birth control, because the view was, why do you need birth control? It's because you want to be promiscuous, right? So it's a moral issue. And Margaret Sanger is actually quite a controversial figure because she really advocated hard for that as a health issue for women, right? That women should have the right to talk to their doctors about birth control and have access to it. Okay, so some people really like Margaret Sanger, and her original organization eventually evolved into Planned Parenthood, which continues to be a really controversial organization, right? Some people look at them as people who provide health care at low cost to poor people who can't afford it. And some people are like, no, they mostly do abortions and we don't like abortion, right? So that controversy begins with Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger, okay, this is the most controversial part of her at this point, is that she wanted to put these clinics in minority neighborhoods to prevent the births of minorities. Okay, so let me say that again. So she's like, yeah, women, you should have birth control, have control over your life. This is a health issue. But especially minority women, because we don't want your kids born. Okay, and that is a theory that's called eugenics, right? This is almost like Hitler-esque, right? Hitler is like, the Jews are worse, kill them off. Margaret Sanger was like, minorities are worse, don't let them be born. Okay, so this is a pretty like crazy example of how racist the progressives could be. We're going to see under Wilson, Jim Crow laws are going to expand in Washington, D.C. as well. Okay, so this is one part. Progressives are not really interested in addressing racism in the country. That is not a piece of their goals. Okay, here we go, summing up. So major parts of progressivism. This is a movement from 1900 to 1920 that tried to solve problems from immigration, industrialization, and urbanization. If you think about progressivism, that's what you should think about, right? They're trying to fix all this stuff. It included both parties, as we mentioned, 3 presidents, Roosevelt, Taft, Republican, and Wilson, Democrat. They're working on issues like child labor, working conditions, consumer protection, trust busting, women's rights, and political corruption. And in the DBQ assignment that you're going to be doing, you're actually going to be choosing which of these issues do you think is the most important of 4, including save the trees, which we didn't really talk about, saving the environment. Okay, and then the last one is the dark side of progressivism, as we mentioned, was their prevalent racist ideology. Thanks for hanging with us in our quick overview of progressivism. Hope you guys have a great day.